And thank you very much for starting the recording. So, first thing on the agenda is going to be welcome and introductions. So, my name is Micah Chappelle. I'm the IRC TAG Chair. I represent code officials on the State Building Code Council. And we can go from there. Do we want to introduce somebody? Seems like we have some new or some folks on the line. We'd like to go ahead and introduce the TAG members and staff if we could. And I will start with Stoyan.
Stoyan Bumbalov, I'm the State Building Code Council Managing Director, and I'm coordinating this meeting because we don't have, when we say council staff, we don't have staff left. So you'll stuck with me for a little bit.
We don't mind being stuck with you, Stoyan.
Okay, you're welcome.
All right, I'm just going to go down the list. Thad, at least the list that I can see.
Hi, I'm Thad Kurtz. I'm here as a citizen. I have a proposal on the agenda today.
Excellent, Thad. Quinn?
Sorry, guys. Couldn't get the unmute button there. Quinn Tai, City of Tacoma. I am representing the code officials for this tag meeting.
Thanks, Quinn. We have Tina, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly.
Tina Risley with the Northwest HVAC Association and Training Center in Spokane, Washington.
Excellent. Thank you. Darren?
I'm Darren Graham with BHC Consultants, representing code consultant position.
Thanks, Darren. Damon?
Morning, I'm Damon Doyle. I'm here representing the residential home builders.
Well, Damon. Ron?
Ron Perkowitz, Inspection and Permit Services, and I'm representing BIAW.
Excellent. Annette?
Hi, I'm Annette Hayworth. I am the admin assistant for the State Building Code Council, taking notes.
Great, thank you. Daniel? Oh, looks like we have Dan muted. We can come back to Daniel. Kim?
I'm Kim Barker with King County Permitting, just observing today.
Excellent, thank you. Ernesto?
Ernesto Avalar, Laborers Union, just here as to observe.
Excellent. Jen?
Hi, I'm Jen Eluk, and I'm a plans examiner with the City of Bellevue.
Thank you, Jen. Andrea?
Good morning, Andrea Smith with BIW.
Morning. Kathleen?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kathleen Petrie with King County, and I am the proponent of 2 of the proposals today.
Excellent. Alex? All right, we can come back to Alex. Annie?
Annie O'Rourke with the Peninsula Housing Authority representing affordable housing.
Welcome, Annie. Tara?
Tara Smith Anderson with Williams Northwest Pipeline.
Thank you. Ken?
Ken Brulette, Seattle Fire Department.
Welcome. John?
John Siu, technical consultant with the Washington Association of Building Officials.
Welcome, John. Todd?
Good morning, Todd Short. I work for the City of Redmond Fire Department. I represent the fire service on this tag.
All right. Morning, Todd. Kinley?
Good morning. Kinley Deller, King County Solid Waste.
Morning. Sean?
Sean Mullins, Owens Corning.
Excellent. We'll try Alex one more time.
Good morning. Sorry, Alex Erzin, also King County Solid Waste.
Excellent. Welcome, Alex. And Daniel. All right, we're not able to get Daniel off mute, seems like. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate everybody's time this morning. We will try to get through the agenda with the time we've allotted. We will see. Okay, next item on the agenda is to review and approve the agenda. If there's any changes or if there's any change in order to the code change proposals, if some folks need to jump off the call early, please let me know. We can modify that agenda before we approve it.
Point of order, Mr. Chair, just to say that we're not going to do the roll call. I tracked the folks that are attending and we have a quorum. Just to say it for the record.
Appreciate that, Stoyan. All right. Any changes to the agenda today? Excellent. Hearing none, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
So moved. Yep. Second.
Appreciate that. We have a motion, a second. And if there's any opposition to that motion, please say nay. Excellent. Hearing none, agenda is approved. Next item will be to review the minutes and approve those. Can we pull those up on the screen for a moment? If possible?
Unfortunately, we don't have the minutes. We're trying to catch up. We're trying to catch up with the council meetings, and we'll get on track probably next week.
Okay, great. All right. So with that, we will skip item number 3 and move into item number 4, our code change proposals. And since there were no changes, we will start with 026.
026 is coming. There it is. So this is for electric vehicle. Yes, the proponent is here. So that.
Should I say something by way of introduction at this point?
Absolutely.
Oh, you get the stage.
Okay, so HB 1287 requires the Code Council to adopt residential and commercial codes that will support the anticipated levels of zero emissions vehicle use that result from the state's zero emission vehicle requirements, and that will achieve the reductions that are needed to reach the state's greenhouse gas emissions limits. As part of reaching those limits, the state is committed to phasing out new gas and diesel light vehicles by 2035 and has just adopted a clean fuels standard and an aspirational 2030 phase out goal. These state policies will require a dramatic increase in EVs on the road and a dramatic increase in chargers for them long before the buildings that we're constructing now are obsolete. Charging at home is the simplest and cheapest way to charge an EV. It's also much cheaper and easier to provide the means for that when residences are being built than it is for individuals or tenants or the owners of larger residential buildings to get that charging infrastructure added later. The council has already adopted changes to the Iebc in response to 1287's requirement. My proposal is intended to provide for the residential half of that requirement. As I understand it, there are several differences between Kathleen Petrie's proposal addressing this issue and mine. This proposal covers residential units with parking spaces as well as those with private parking. Her proposal requires actual chargers for private parking. Mine allows a receptacle in buildings with private garages. This would reduce initial costs, and I think that someone with a private garage can easily buy a charger and plug it in if they have an EV. They don't have to worry about a plug-in charger being stolen, though I think that someone with a private carport still might worry about that. If they're renting and move, they can also take a plug-in charger with them. The rest of my proposal for buildings with on-site parking but no private garages follows the recently adopted language for the Iebc with a few small changes for clarity. I think the only significant difference is that it drops the Iebc's exemption for some occupancies with less than 10 parking spaces. That exemption may make sense for some small commercial uses, but drivers in small multifamily housing will benefit from infrastructure that makes it cheaper and easier to provide residential charging just as much as the drivers at larger complexes do. I actually think from an equity issue that the benefits of having an electric car are probably largest for middle and low income drivers because the real savings come from the operational costs of the car. And if you're buying a secondhand EV, of which there are going to be more and more on the market, you're to a certain extent insulated from the currently higher initial costs of buying a new one. I have dropped the IB phrase here, applying the requirements to parking garages, because I didn't think there were any residential buildings with parking garages. And I also thought that if there were, my phrase about on-site parking would cover those, but that may not be right. I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you, Thad. If we could, can we go through your proposal and start looking at some of the language, and then I will open the floor to the TAG members for discussion.
Do you want me to start with the definitions? As far as I see, the definitions are the same as the definitions adopted in Iebc. Is that
my understanding?
So I can skip the definitions then and get to the language right here. Micah, is that all right?
That's perfectly fine. I can't remember, Stoyan, did we eliminate or modify some of the definitions for the building code? I know we had some that were doubled up or similar in scope, and so I can't remember if we modified some of those or even changed one or two.
Do you mean between CR 102 and CR 103?
Correct.
No, we didn't touch anything.
Okay. All right, then we will, if do any of the TAG members have questions on the definitions? All right, I'll take silence as a no. Then we will start at the proposed change to or new addition of R335 for electric vehicle charging. And again, I'll open the floor for TAG members to start discussing.
This is Ron. I've got a couple of comments on it, if I could.
Absolutely, please.
Okay, so in there, it talks about all new buildings and doesn't single it out as really for the IRC, which may or may not be a little bit of a conflict, but when it talks about all buildings, so I live on a 25-acre farm and I want to build a machine shed for my diesel tractors, and now I have, because I have parking so on the property, I have to now put an EV charging station in. There's no exceptions for accessory buildings that don't even have electricity to them. So maybe he can address that.
Here is the exception. I'm sorry. Here is the exception for the power supply.
Where is, I looked, I didn't see an exception in there.
It's highlighted right here.
Okay, I can't, I'm not looking at the screen. So if you just tell me the section,
okay.
I'll check it later. But
Sorry, Ron. So for section 335.1, under the charging language, there are some exceptions. One of them does state, exception number 1, there is no public utility or commercial power supply. However, I do kind of parrot Ron's concern there. Does that indicate that there's no utility or power supply to that specific accessory structure, or no public utility or commercial power supply to the parcel? There's no clarity there, and that would be a concern of mine as well. But go ahead, Ron, please. Did we lose Ron? If you're speaking, Ron, you're muted.
okay, no, I'm back on here. I just I lost you for a second on the voice, but I I understand the exceptions now, so, but still, I think we need to clarify that this is for the IRC and, you know, this all buildings thing, because he does talk about, I believe even in his introduction today, talks about all buildings are larger residential, and we need to get it back to the 4 or less units.
So I had, this is Thad, I had assumed that if I said new buildings in the residential code, that would imply residential buildings, but it sounds as if it would be good to have residential in there in the very first line.
Is the proposal for residential buildings or for dwellings? Because there's many other types of residential buildings, like we've kind of thrown out a couple of examples, but right now I'm reviewing an accessory building that's a music studio. There could be a pool house.
Oh.
So is it, let me ask you a question. Is it under a residential code? You know what you're reviewing?
Are you asking me?
Yes. Yes.
Yes, yeah. So I have just the same concerns that this doesn't really start from a place of 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses.
I have some similar concerns as Jen. I do see a hand up. We can come back to you, Jen. Go ahead, Darren.
Well, thank you very much. Hey, as a former builder, I wanted to take a little bit of a run at the cost analysis that was done. Adding a 30 amp surface isn't as easy as that looks, because what happens is traditionally homes are built with a 150, 200 amp service. That amp is already set up. Those amperages are already used. You're going to, when you're talking about adding extra amperage to that panel, you're talking about upgrading that panel. Running a 220 line to the garage, or at least a 30 amp line, and adding that into the board is far more than the $1,000 that we set. And the retrofit number of $3,500, that might actually be a little bit high. Just retrofitted my garage, cost me $950. So it's just the number. And here's the challenge that we have. I'm the realtor representative here. Every $1,000 that we add to the price of a home, we have, at least in our market alone, that means that 240 families can no longer afford that home. It's literally that much of a difference. So when we start adding $3,000 and $4,000 to the cost of these homes at a time when, by any measure, Washington State has one of the worst levels of available housing in the entire country. So for us at this point to be adding to them, where the actual savings for individuals may not be represented, I don't know. We're going to have a difficult time when it comes to adding these levels of costs to structures, when we would be voting against it. Thank you.
If I could just address this comment, this is Thad again. I have looked at this research about the results of adding $1,000 to the initial cost of a house. What the research actually says is that if you look at the mortgage eligibility of someone who is buying a median house in the area, and you look at the people who are actually at the top range of that, you will find that there are, whatever Darren's number is, 235, 350 people who will be bumped out of the eligibility for a mortgage at that level into the next higher requirement. They won't be eligible for a mortgage for that particular house. They will have to buy a slightly less expensive house instead, if that's all they can afford. So it is, I mean, it is a real piece of research, but it doesn't mean exactly what it sounds as if it means on first glance. My other comment would be is that $1,000 is going to be amortized over 20 years in the mortgage, that its actual ongoing annual cost for the homeowner will be minimal, and that it'll be more than made up by the operational savings of being able to put an electric vehicle in use more cheaply.
On this, we will firmly disagree, and I will be happy to share with you the research that was done by people a lot smarter than me
I
as
think I
far
have-
as far as price regards.
I think I have looked at the research in question, and I think my description of it is accurate.
Yeah. We will respectfully disagree, sir.
It's the National Association of Builders researches, I think, what you're talking about.
Okay. Thank you, Darren, for the comment, and thank you, Thad, for the response.
Micah, can I change my hat a little bit and add a comment here?
Sure.
Okay, so I will share my experience. Most of you know my background is in California, so I'm still trying to fit in here in Washington State. But I'm one of the persons that, you know, when you guys say California did it, I don't like that because I know most of the proposals there, you know, and I know how good they are, and you know, without details involved in that. But for the electric vehicles, I was in the team that developed this electric vehicle proposals for California in 2010, 2011. And this was the first one and two family dwellings and townhomes with attached garages. And there was an exception for 1,000 square feet, $1,000 per dwelling unit. And at that time, we did some calculations. We did electrical service calculations, and the result was that if you have 200 amp service panel, only houses above 5,000 square feet may require panel upgrade. More than 5,000. How many we have? And for these years between 2012 and now, I'm not aware of any single time that this exception for $1,000 per dwelling unit was used. So one and two family. Another thing, there was a study at one time, a research in California for owners of electric vehicles, and it was going on until 2016, I think, when they discontinued that. And the research was showing that more than 90% of the electric vehicle owners were living in single family dwellings. So I don't think the same numbers will appear now, because more and more folks that own electric vehicles live in apartments and condominiums. However, one and two family dwellings will still be the electric vehicle owners, most of them will live in one and two family dwellings. So the council adopted these requirements for structures covered by International Building Code. And now, if there is nothing for one and two family dwellings, then it completely defeats the purpose of having regulations for electric vehicle charging.
Understandable. But Stoney, don't forget, you also have new requirements now for electric appliances. And those electric appliances are using far more energy off that panel than one's done else.
I was gonna say that I'm willing to prepare another a few examples that will show, you know, the electrical service panel calculations, feeder calculations that will show when we add additional receptacle outlet in the garage, how it will affect the service, if that will help. So I will switch my hat again to being facilitated.
All right, thanks, Stoyan. The input.
I have this is Ron. I have a comment.
Okay. Go ahead, Ron.
I agree with Damien. You know, we're loading up with heat pump water heaters and on, deleting natural gas. So there's more of an electrical load. $1,000 here may not seem like much, but he had 1,000 here and 1,000 there and 1,000 there and 1,000 there. And pretty soon people are out of luck. The other thing is, I know our county is developing zoning regulations that are covering exactly the same thing. And it's getting a very strong debate on the local level. And maybe we should just back off a little bit and hold this proposal. I can tell you right now, I'm going to vote against it at this time. And I just don't think we're quite ready to throw this in the code. I'm sorry, but that's my feelings.
Okay, thank you, Ron. there other council or other tag members would like to provide some input on the sections that are shown on the screen at this time?
Micah, this is Todd Short.
Go ahead, Todd.
I have a question. It seems like what we're asking for in this proposal is to provide the electrical connection with a 40 amp circuit, but it is also saying the EV charging equipment has to also be installed. Is that correct?
No. As I understand the proposal, what it says is that if you have a private garage, all you have to install is a 240 receptacle. If you've got a building with parking spaces that are not private, then you have the same requirements that you do for the commercial code that the council has
sorry.
moved forward for public comment.
I'm negative.
Can you help us get,
I'm sorry.
coming in now, but we're gonna.
Can we get, thank you. Thank you for muting.
So in the proposed 335.2, you're saying that or a receptacle outlet in the close proximity of where somebody may put in charging equipment. So the requirement here is for the electrical capability. Is that correct?
Yes, it's to have an actual plug in the garage so that somebody can just buy a $400 charger if they get a car and plug it in there without having to do anything else. Or it's also possible to meet the requirement by actually installing a charger when the building is constructed, but that's not necessary in this proposal.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that.
Thank you, Todd. Can we scroll back up just a little to the beginning of the section again? Starting right there is fine. I do have some concerns with the charging language. Although it does indicate it applies to new residential buildings, it says and accessory structures. Obviously, accessory structures are incidental to a dwelling. So what this is telling me is you would actually have to provide 2 outlets on a site if it had a dwelling unit and an accessory structure, because it says both. Then when we get into the next or the second line, the electrical vehicle supply equipment, you're pointing to the NEC, which may not be correct per the residential code, because the residential code does cover electrical items. However, that may not apply for the Washington state. Then when we get into the exceptions, again, I'm going to voice my concern about the utility or commercial power supply. Is that parcel specific or structure specific? And then we're talking about garages or other on-site parking dwelling units that do not have those. I'm not even sure the need for that. I mean, if you have no on-site parking, you have no on-site parking, whether it's a garage or on-site parking. Then we get into 335.2. I agree with Todd. It kind of, the way I read that, it said it, yes, you're kind of indicating it shall be installed at a charger or receptacle. But when you get into 335.3, that doesn't give you the option. It says buildings and accessory structures. So again, that will be 2 locations if they're both on the same lot. For 335.3 says shall be provided with EV charging stations. Period. That's what 335.3 says. So again, I'm gonna parrot Todd's concern that this tells you that your building and accessory structure for new construction has to be provided with a charging station. That's what 335.3 says.
Just to clarify one thing in relation to your remarks, my rationale for actually not allowing the receptacles if you don't have private parking is that if you have a receptacle and you plug your own charger into a receptacle in a space that's not private, you're exposed to somebody strolling along and unplugging your charger and walking away with it. So we'd go from having catalytic converters picked up and stolen to having chargers in non-private parking areas picked up and unplugged and walked away with. I don't think that's very satisfactory.
I don't necessarily disagree, but I don't think that is something that the residential building code could address. I think, you know, if you're talking about something being stolen, I'm not sure how we could address that in this scenario.
I was just trying to explain why I thought it was all right to just have a receptacle in a private garage. And I thought it was necessary, that it wasn't adequate to allow a receptacle in a space that was exposed in a building that had on-site parking, but no privacy.
Right. So I
Mike,
see where you're going with that. Go ahead. Others?
Did I capture your concern in 335.2?
That's fine. It can be either or in that scenario for the private garage, if that's what the proponent wants. I do have my concerns with the way it reads. But really my other concern is going to be 335.3, which states if you have on-site parking, you have to provide EV charging stations at your building and your accessory structure. Again, others can, then with Quinn, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Oh, I was wondering if it changes to buildings or changing the and to an or, would that be better?
I'm not sure. I think it still says if you have one or the other that you still have to provide on-site or EV charging stations just because you have on-site parking. And I probably read it differently than others. Jen? I think you're muted, Jen.
Thanks. I have the same concerns that you just expressed. Also, again, seeing that maybe this language sort of borrowed from the Iebc. What is on-site parking? That's not really, I don't know if that's a definition above, but that's not really clear, as clear for IRC. So with, say, an apartment building, there are defined parking spaces. But if you have, you know, let's say you have a detached garage and you have some like a gravel drive that goes over to it, does that considered on-site parking? So how you even kind of split those hairs is unclear. You know, if you have an accessory structure in the backyard, you have a garage and you have a driveway, you know, at the front of the house, what is considered the on-site parking for that accessory building in the rear? And above here, 335.2, so you have a new single family residence. You may also have an accessory dwelling unit within that new single family residence that hasn't been really common up until now because land use guidelines have prohibited that, but that is changing as affordable housing is needed. So you could have a new single family residence with an accessory dwelling within it, and then a private garage that is only accessible to the main home. But now you're going to need 2 circuits within that garage, even though the occupants of the accessory dwelling unit may not be able to access that garage. Does that make sense?
Seems so. I think I see where you're going with that.
So it sounds as if I need to look for some new language that will clarify this issue about exactly. I had thought that if you had a building, a single family residence, and it had a detached garage, that would count as an accessory structure. But it's obvious that there are some other accessory structures I hadn't thought about. So I think I should probably try to work out a revision of this language and bring it back.
Okay. Sounds like an idea. Jen, you have your hand up again, and Quinn.
Yeah. Some accessory dwelling units may not have any parking at all. So just keep that in mind. And also the exception seems misplaced. It's like we have the exception before we have the requirement in a way. So just organizationally, it seems like we typically say this is exactly what's required, and then here's the exception.
Thank you for those recommendations, Jen. Quinn?
Yeah, so I might be a minority on this one, but I actually kind of like the direction that Tad is going with this. Some of the concerns that were raised, I just personally don't see it. At least that's not how I would have interpreted some of the languages. But I do see that there could potentially be confusion moving forward with the way some of the language is written. So Tad, if you take some of the recommendations that we just talked about and clean it up a little bit, that it would definitely be a lot better. But I mean, like I said, for the most part, I like it. And, you know, again, I don't have a huge concern over any of this stuff because that's how I interpret it. So I would have voted, you know, for it with some caveats. But if you come back later and with some changes with the, you know, like I said, the or, putting the or in there. I wasn't too concerned with Jen's concern about the ADUs because that would be the one, it's a single family residence with an ADU. So it's considered still a single family residence. So that garage is still, if I were to review it, I would still only require one. But anyways, just clean it up a little bit. And I think it might be better moving forward.
Thanks, Quinn. Annie?
Thanks, Micah. Stoyan, can you scroll down to the table about how many parking spaces? Great. Okay, so I just need some clarity on how this table is enforced. When I see this, say I've got a 2-car garage with parking out in front of those 2 doors to my garage. I'm understanding those as being 2 on-site parking spaces. Therefore, I need to follow this table in order to determine what additional features I need to build in. And as I'm looking at this, number of EV charging stations, 10% of total parking spaces, round up to the nearest full number. Therefore, I need 1 EV charging station. Going to the next column, number of additional EV parking ready parking spaces, 25% of total parking spaces. So I would need an additional EV ready parking space over and above the EV charging station. Then I go to the 3rd column, I see number of additional EV capable parking spaces, 10% of total parking spaces. I'm adding another parking space because up in the charging language, it talks about and. So EV charging station, additional EV ready parking spaces, and EV capable parking spaces. Is it your intent that you would actually require 3 additional features with regards to EV charging?
No, as I understand your example, I have 2 total parking spaces in this building. 10% of that is 2/10. I round up to the nearest whole number. So you're required to have 1 EV charging station in that situation.
So what's the point of the number of additional EV ready parking spaces column and the number of additional EV capable parking spaces columns?
If you have a big townhouse structure with 40 units that are in the townhouse, then you're required to have, you're going to have more than 10 total parking spaces, and you're required to provide some additional infrastructure for expanding the parking in that building in the future.
And I think we need to kind of look at the scope of what the International Residential Code actually covers and keep that in mind, because the bulk of what you're building with the IRC is single family residences. So you're not talking a 40 unit townhouse project. That would not be something under this code. And so I think it is confusing in the way the charging language says you're going to have each of these, and here's the table and the percentages round up to the nearest whole number. Just, you know, following the words on the page, I'm coming up with a requirement that you have 3 features at that 2-car garage.
So if I have a townhouse that has 50 units with shared sidewalls, that's not built under the residential code? That's what
The-
this is intended to apply to.
If you have property lines separating each building is its own property, its own lot, and would be its own building permit.
But if I don't have property lines separating the buildings, if it's
A 40
if it's
unit,
townhouses for rentals,
I don't see that being built under the IRC, and maybe one of the building folks can chime in.
We have a hand up from John. Did you want to provide some input on that?
Yeah, just in response to that, yes, theoretically, you could build a 40-unit townhouse, 50-unit townhouse, whatever, under the IRC. It's not generally done, but it can be.
Okay, thank you, John. I also kind of have some concerns about what Annie's talking about with the infrastructure indicated there and what you need to provide. I could be just based on, I would question, what are we considering a parking space in this instance? So if you have a required parking space for each individual dwelling unit, but let's say you have 10 or 15 provided guest spaces, do those count as parking spaces as well that have to be part of this calculation, although they are not a required parking space? So maybe we do need to look at specifying that this only applies to the required parking spaces. And then as Annie mentioned, the table seems to, it doesn't specify this is for townhouse. You know, how are you going to identify on-site parking for individual dwellings? I think Jen kind of mentioned that previously as well. If you've got, you know, a 40-foot long driveway with a 2-car garage and maybe a separate detached garage, are you going to calculate that that has 6 or 8 parking spaces or on-site parking spaces? There's no direction here in this code change proposal to identify what a parking space is. Is it a required parking space, or is it anything somebody can call a parking space? So I'll open it up a little more. And Stoyan, if you want to scroll down, I maybe we've kind of covered a lot of what you've shown on the screen. I know there's more to this proposal, and I'd like to be able to provide Thad with information on other sections that the tag may have concern with, if he's going to bring back some changes to this.
Can I provide a little clarity here? So we have 3 different types. So we have 1 and 2 family dwellings. This is the first one. We have townhouses with private garages. This is the second. And then we are going to 335.3. I think, listening to the comments, I think you folks are mixing up 335.2 with 335.3. So if you have garages, then you're under 335.2. This is how I see it. But in 335.3, this is for common use parking spaces. At least when I was reading the additional information, this is what I got. Okay, 335.3.1.
I do think that's one way to interpret it, Stoyan. When I look and read that 335.2, if you want to scroll back up since you were discussing that. If there's no private garage for 1 and 2 family dwellings, I would interpret that if there's no private garage, then you would have to go to 335.3 to find your required EV, either capable, ready, charging station, whatever. That's how I would interpret how this is written, and others may chime in to see if that's the same, but that's how I read the titles there in the charging language. 335.3 would apply to everything that doesn't have a private garage that is provided with on-site parking.
What about that?
What about detached garages? Where would those fall?
It doesn't really specify between attached and detached garages. It says just townhouses with private garages.
Right.
Again, based on what I saw with the additional documentation.
Hey,
So
John?
again, what would you follow? 335.2 or 335.3 for a detached garage?
I would apply 335.2.
What about if it didn't have power to it?
Well, then the general exception would apply.
would there be an opportunity or a friendly amendment for there to be clarity on parcel versus building specific on that particular exception?
Oh, I can't speak for the proponent, but I think he promised that.
Okay. So with regards to 335.3, can we choose to put in an EV charging station, an EV ready parking space, or an EV capable parking space? It's, you know, what are we supposed to install under 335.3?
I just compared with what the council adopted for Iebc, and the language seems similar, if not the same. So for 335.3, it makes it the same. I'll give you an example. You have a row of 50 townhomes built under Iebc versus the same type of building structure, but built under IRC. And the proposal is the same here. You need 10% with electric vehicle charging stations. You need 25% with EV ready with receptacle, and you need 10% with conduit. And
so
I wasn't the proponent for the Iebc proposals, and I don't necessarily agree with it, but it was adopted. That's
okay. Thanks,
what I'm
Dorian.
saying.
Go ahead, Annie, and then we have a couple of hands up.
But I'm talking about that single family dwelling on its own lot with, you know, whatever those parking spaces, on-site parking spaces are defined as. What do I have to do? Do I have to do a charging station? Do I have to do EV ready parking spaces? And as that code section says, EV capable parking spaces.
For single family dwelling, you're under 335.2 and you need a 40 amp receptacle outlet.
If it has a garage.
With or without garage.
But and that's where our concern comes in. And I don't read it that way either. I think that's what Annie is getting at.
Right.
So let's take a pause with Stoyan from and let John go ahead with your hand up, and then we'll get to Darren as well.
Yeah, sorry, just from a code writing standpoint, first of all, remember that section titles are not enforceable. So you need to incorporate whatever you're pointing at into the charging language. The way I read 335.3, it says buildings shall be provided with these. So it doesn't apply to the parking lot. That's the way if you're reading it literally, that's the way I would read that. So just again, some language clarification and some better charging language would probably help here.
But John, do you see that requiring at every building a charging station, an EV ready parking space, and cart capable ready?
Well, it depends on what the current language is not clear. I'll say that. If the charging language is improved, it could help answer that question. I think the charging language in 335.2 needs improvement as well, say for the same reason, kind of to say that you need this applies to whether all all 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses. If you got a private garage, this is what you do, whether detached or detached. Again, that's should be part of the charging language.
Okay, thank you, John. Darren?
Just a quick clarification on 335.3. Stoyan, was that supposed to also include accessory dwelling units?
Well, again, I'm not the proponent here, but comparing to the rationale for section 429 in the building code, what it says is it was trying to cover on-site parking. So you have the on-site parking for a row of townhomes. I guess this was the intent. I don't know if it's a good explanation in the section, but that at least this is how I read the rationale behind it.
The reason why I ask is because many of the accessory dwelling units are no longer being required in the Seattle and King County area to have dedicated parking spaces. And I'm just curious how this language would address that.
Well, if it's 335.3, it captures the number of on-site parking. It doesn't capture the number of units. Again, I'm reading the rationale for 429, but it seems the language is the same.
It is similar. However, I want to caution that this is a different code, and there's reasons it is a different code, that the language is not going to align or match. And Darren, just to kind of my thoughts on the accessory dwelling unit, technically accessory dwelling units are not in the residential code. They are just a dwelling unit. They're not something special. And so this may do better to modify, as even John mentioned, I believe, modify the charging language to be more clear in that it seems like the proponent, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Thad, but it seems like you want some type of charging infrastructure for each dwelling unit, whether that's an accessory dwelling unit or just a regular dwelling unit, but you want some type of EV infrastructure for that. And I don't think the charging language gets you there, in my opinion.
Micah, when you say the charging language, I want to make a note here, but which section do you want?
I think if you're going to modify the charging language, that it should be the beginning, 335.1, because right now you're saying that this section applies to new residential buildings. That's anything that can be classified as a residential building. And maybe that needs to be changed to dwelling units.
Okay.
Or dwelling unit, singular. And we're spending quite a bit of time on this. We should move on down the proposal a little more, get Thad a little more information, and get on to some of the other proposals. I know we have a lot of big ones on the plate today, so hopefully we're giving Thad some direction. But let's move on to the next couple of sections of this proposal, please, Dwayne.
Yes, sir.
Micah, can I chime in really quick? For some reason, I don't have my hand raise button. I don't know if I need to restart Zoom or whatnot. This is Damon Doyle. Starting in 2011, we started putting in 40 amp 240 circuits in all of our projects. And in fact, we started it on a townhouse project. It seems to me we have a lot of language in here that's commercial and not residential. One of the things we did not do was actually put in the charger itself. So we just ran the circuit and put a blank over it because there are 3 different types of charging circuits and we didn't know what people were going to choose. In most cases, they're hardwired. It's not a receptacle. So I think simply providing the circuit so that it's there for people to later on put a charging station in is most appropriate. Currently, less than 3% of cars on the road are EV. Granted, we know that's going to raise, but at least 9 out of 10 people who buy these units are not going to use these circuits. I would like to see this language get simplified to say A, just a charging circuit, and B, for each dwelling. And I don't think we need to go into parking spaces or anything else. That's all.
Okay, thank you, Damon. And for those of you not aware, Damon is a current SBCC member. And Damon, you're representing residential contractors or builders, if I'm correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Appreciate you being here.
Is it, Damon, is it how you said 335.2?
Yes, that's perfect. If you had that as well as the 2 exceptions above, I think we're done.
Okay, thank you for that recommendation. That's something Thad can take into consideration when he brings some modifications. Let's go ahead and scroll down, Stoyan, and get into a little more and provide some additional feedback. That way, if Damon decides to, come back with a full proposal like this or something simplified, he's got enough information. All right, I'm going to again open it up for some comments to this section or these sections.
I mean, I should just say this is exactly what the council adopted for the commercial requirements that it's moving forward with. And I did it this way basically because I thought it would be desirable to have consistency between the IRC's requirements for big townhouse construction and the commercial requirements. But
Yeah, and again, as was mentioned earlier, there is a difference between the IRC and the Iebc. And when you bring up the 50 unit townhome, that's 50 dwellings. So you'd have 50 chargers. So nothing falls through the cracks.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for that comment, Damon. Anybody else on these sections? All right, I will provide a little input from me. I think that 335.3.1 is redundant, and then it also seems to indicate it's something further than what was required above, where the indication above was a receptacle. This says that if you have an EV ready parking space, that you have to provide more. It just seems to try to align with the IBC, but I don't think that's the best route. This also talks about the 335.3.2. This again is getting into electrical installation requirements, or raceways are covered by the NEC or other parts of the residential code. And this gets into a new section, a new chapter that probably, if we're going to use other sections, should just point to those sections and not duplicate the language. And then this talks about a raceway. And correct me if I'm wrong, Damon, it's been a long time since I've done residential electrical, but normally in a residential building, you're not going to have a raceway. You are just going to install some type of probably non-metallic cabling within the wall space. Now, if you have a parking space outside, maybe that's still attached to the structure and within the wall space, or maybe at that point, if you have to go underground somewhere, you would need to provide a raceway. But this is saying you need to provide a raceway no matter what, and I'm not sure if that's correct.
Yeah, this would be very, very unusual in a residential situation.
Thank you for the clarification. All right, and then again, with the electrical rooms or equipment, I think that's probably already covered in other sections of either the NEC or the electrical installation itself, and doesn't necessarily need to be repeated here.
I would concur.
All right, any other thoughts on this that's shown on the screen from TAG members or even public members? All right. And then this last section, 335.5, I'm not necessarily opposed to this. I know that a lot of folks will say, accessibility doesn't apply to single family residential. However, that may be a little different depending on the number of units you have for townhouses. But again, I could go either way on that section, but I will open the floor for discussion on that exact point.
On there's no, I don't think discussion on location of the charging stations, especially when you get to the 50 unit houses. So it's supposed to keep them limited, or how are they located? All the discussions we're having in our local zoning code is that they seem to be pushing ADA parking stalls off to the side so that these become more of a priority stalls. So maybe we need to have some discussion about location of the charging station in the parking area.
Okay. I may have been having a little trouble with your audio, Ron. It may just be me. I'm not sure if others did either. It sounded like you wanted to discuss some locations of these either stations for ADA parking or the ADA parking itself. And I'm not sure if I was on that from.
No, I was saying we should talk about location of these stations, how they're dispersed on the property, so we don't end up with a conflict with ADA stalls.
Okay.
That can be better.
That did sound a little better. Did folks hear that okay, besides me?
I'm sorry, Ron, I thought that this requirement would mean that you needed to have some charging vehicle infrastructure at the ADA stalls. Is that? Not that you'd need to have additional accessible parking.
No, I wanted to make sure that when you define the charging stations and how there's no discussion about where they're distributed in the parking lot. And we don't want them to be in conflict with ADA stalls.
That was clear.
The International Residential Code has the accessibility requirements in section R320, and it refers to the building code. And chapter 11 of the building code refers to, currently we are under 2017 ANSI A117.1. So everything is addressed there. Repeating this language in the residential code, as a personal opinion, I think it's not a good idea.
Thanks, Stoyan. I do have some concerns with the ADA, especially since this seems to not differentiate for single family. If you have a single family dwelling unit, this says you shall provide EV parking, accessible EV charging and EV ready parking spaces in accordance with the Iebc. Again, currently ADA does not apply to single family residential or 1 and 2 family residential.
It's very careful when you use the term ADA. ADA 2010 ADA standards do apply to single family if they're part of public housing. When we get to chapter 11, so it's not for the building departments to enforce, but this is for developers to take this into account. So ADA, we are dealing with ADA, Fair Housing Act. We have section 504 UFAS. So the residential code is not the best place to mix up all this. So single family dwellings, how the scoping is written in chapter 11, 1 and 2 family dwellings are not covered. And again, section 320 specifically refers to the type of buildings that will be covered by chapter 11.
Okay, thank you, Stoyan. All right, go ahead, Quinn, you have your hand.
But then,
Yeah, I would agree with Stoyan on this one. I don't think we need this language in 335.5. 320 already takes us there. And if anything, it would capture the at 50 townhome units under 320. But Stoyan is right that 335.5 would basically mean every single family resident with an EV charging would be required to be accessible. So I think leaving it in 320 is perfectly fine, and removing it here would be good.
All right, thank you, Quinn. Any other comments on the proposal at this time? Okay, thank you, everyone.
Micah, this is Todd. Just one quick point. I'd be a little concerned if we switched this language to dwellings in regards to accessory dwelling units. I'm not sure, at least for Redmond, we look at a main house and the accessory dwelling is under similar ownership. And I'm not sure we would need 2 charging stations just because somebody had an ADU.
Okay. Thanks for that. Go ahead, Thad. Did you want to respond to that real fast?
No. I will listen to the recording. It seems like as if we've taken a lot of time here for this. I'll listen to the recording and I'll come back with a revised proposal next month.
All right. Thank you, Thad. I appreciate
And
your time.
I will email you the document with the notes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I got to get over to my agenda to say what's next. Too many screens open as always. All right, looks like we will be moving on to proposal 091.
Here it is.
All right, this one's going to be a similar topic. So I will turn the time over to Kathleen to give us a little background on your proposal, and then we'll start discussing the sections.
Yeah, thank you, Micah. And hello, everybody. I'm Kathleen Petrie with King County. And
Get that CJ sent you with the F-100. It was unavailable.
Sorry, hold on,
Now they
Kathleen.
want it sold.
Ron, can we get you to mute, please? Thank you.
sorry about that. Thank you. Just wanted to have a proposal submitted with respect to EV ready. And so whether it's Thad's proposal that moves forward or this proposal, either is great. We just want to have that infrastructure in there because of the zero energy, or excuse me, zero emission policy by Washington State, 100% EV sales by 2030, or non-combustion sales. And so essentially, yeah, it's where there's required parking for attached private garages or townhomes, or excuse me, carports attached to a single family or townhomes, that you have the required space be EV ready. And so I didn't know if this should land in chapter 19 or in chapter 3, so I just took a crack at one of them. The other bit is that I'm still a bit confused by the definitions that landed in the Iebc. So typically per industry, when I'm chatting with folks out in the industry, you've got EVSE, which is all the infrastructure plus the installed charger unit. And then you have EV ready, which has all the, the circuit and the wiring and up to a junction box or outlet. And that is EV ready. The electrical code, EVSE, does not necessarily specify that it has the charging unit at the end. So I didn't know exactly which term to utilize, but the intent of this proposal is that the space is EV ready. So that's what I would like to share. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. So I will open the floor for TAG members to start discussing the proposal, or any other members of the public to join in.
This seems seems to be much closer to what I was recommending on the previous proposal. Just simply providing a circuit, so being EV ready for each dwelling unit. Much more straightforward. I don't know if this is the correct section to put it in, but I do like the simplicity.
Thank you, Damon.
Is it the intent that every required parking space have it, or each dwelling unit have one?
Every required parking space.
Required by the city or the jurisdiction having authority?
Correct.
Okay, good question. Do we have other questions? Please feel free to join in.
So here again is a case where if you have a 3-car garage, now you're running an additional 120 amps. And now you're probably gone from a 200 amp service to a 320 amp service. That all of a sudden is a significant additional cost. I would be in support of each dwelling unit, but not each parking space.
May I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
So typically the local code will require, one space per one unit. So if it's, but so to Damon's comment, are you saying that, say, a duplex, would you, per this language, the intent would be that you would have 2 receptacles? Are you suggesting perhaps that duplex would only have 1, or no, you said per dwelling, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And so if you had a 3-car garage to a single family, if there's really only 1 required parking space, then we would still just have the 1 receptacle. Or do you think that there are interpretations by certain jurisdictions whereby just the number of spaces that you would provide in that garage would automatically indicate that those spaces were required?
That is a good clarification. I'm thinking in terms of single family primarily, where there really isn't a required parking space. So in that case, you could say, I have a 3-car garage, but I'm not required to have it. Therefore, I don't need a charging station.
Okay, I'm hearing you. So my interpretation of most codes, they would have like 1 space required per single family and or, you know, townhouse unit. And so I'm not sure the 3 would be triggered, but so if just by switching the text to dwelling versus required space, would that be an appropriate change?
In my opinion, yes.
I think that keeps zoning departments kind of out of the picture when it comes to identifying where EV parking space are required, because, you know, there are jurisdictions that don't have any requirements. There are jurisdictions that have 2 requirements. And it doesn't seem appropriate to have it change from one jurisdiction to the other. So let's just go ahead and clarify it and say for each dwelling unit.
Okay, thank you.
We have a hand up by Darren and then Quinn.
Yeah, just of note, the construction analysis was done in 2016 based on 2014 to 15 data. That cost, I can guarantee you, is extremely low compared to what realistic prices are today. Just for example, the panel alone has gone up in price from about $540 in 2015 to about $2,200 alone right now, just for the panel. And so just as we're trying to stay consistent with good numbers, well, we ought to try to find something that's a little stronger than 2016 study.
We'll do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that point, Darren. Quinn?
Yeah, I actually like the original language better because if we just say dwelling units, going back to the scenario where there's no parking required and all of a sudden there's no parking, but now you have this language that says the dwelling unit is required to have it with no parking. So what do? Right? So I think the required parking space would, in my opinion, be better, because at that point, if there's no parking required, then you don't need to put one in. But if there's only one required, then you got to have one. But if we were to just say dwelling unit, then now, even if there's no parking required, somehow you got to, at least how I'm interpreting it, you got to put one in. So that's the only concern I have if we were to change it.
Okay, thanks for that input, Quinn. Maybe we could modify it a little further to state where on-site parking is provided to that dwelling unit. And then we're going to go with John. You have your hand up, and then Jen.
Yeah, Kathleen, something just to think about. You said earlier in your explanation that the intent was to get the infrastructure there, essentially get it EV ready. But electrical vehicle supply equipment, the definition seems to include also a charger, could include a charger.
I was looking at this.
I'm sorry, John, I couldn't hear what you were saying.
Yeah, I know. Can we get Nathan to?
Nathan, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Kathleen, the electrical vehicle supply equipment, the definition, it seems to include possibly the charger, if I read apparatus.
Yeah.
And so the requirement in 1905-11 doesn't say how much of the equipment you have to install. So it's very wide open to whatever your building official wants to say how much of it. Could be zero, could be all the way to including a charger. So we might want to be clearer about that.
Yeah, thank you, John. So here's the challenge in the definitions. And this is based on my interpretation, so maybe I'm still missing something here. But that is based on, so that definition is what is in the electrical code. And so, and it says, or, you can have the actual unit. And in the Iebc definitions, even the EV ready, parking space says it can be provided with a charger or just with the receptacle outlet, which I believe is a similar interpretation as to the EBSC definition. So I'm still a little bit confused as to where we would land there per the definitions, if anybody can provide.
Sorry, I'm just saying that as it's certain right now, it's very wide open to interpretation.
What definitions would you utilize here?
I don't know. If you I guess you know, if your intent is to just have EV ready, that means to me you stop at the outlet, as you said, the outlet or the receptacle or the junction box. And so I don't know. I haven't looked at the other definitions that closely, but you know, again, this definition includes the apparatus, which to me is again the actual charger, then this can be read to include that you have to put the charger in as well.
Okay, thank you.
And so I don't have an opinion on how to clarify it, just that it should be though.
Okay, thank you.
For IBC, because of this confusion, we stayed away of electric vehicle supply equipment. It's defined term in IBC, but for the purposes of, you know, the electric system, that's otherwise the table 429.2, I think it was, the table makes a difference between EV capable, EV ready, and EV charging station or system. And it defines each one of these terms to identify, you know, here is a conduit only, here is a receptacle outlet, and here is the charger that is required. So the electric vehicle supply equipment is not used in the way how it's proposed here in IRC.
Okay, okay, thank you, Stoyan.
Thanks, Stoyan. Yeah, I'll kind of agree with that from Stoyan and John and other, based on also what I heard in the previous proposal, that it sounds like for dwelling units that the best termination would just be at a junction box. That way, if the homeowner or tenant, you know, decides to purchase an EV, then they can decide what their charger looks like or needs are. I think Damon mentioned there was 3 different ones on the market currently for residential, and so that would give them the opportunity to just, if your stuff is there in the junction, it's terminated at a junction box, then they can come in and have that receptacle installed. And then as to the section, I do have a little concern with where the section is based on just the charging language for mechanical. It states that the provisions of chapters 12 through 24 shall regulate the design, installation, etc. of mechanical systems that are permanently installed to control environmental conditions within buildings. So I don't think that section is correct, because this is not controlling an environmental within a building. I do believe maybe that would fall better in one of the electrical sections. And I think that starts at chapter 34. That's just my initial opinion if we're going to put it in a further section in the IRC.
Okay, great. Thank you. Appreciate that.
And then Thad, you have your hand up. Please go ahead.
From the point of view of a homeowner, I want to argue strongly in favor of a receptacle rather than a junction box. Most homeowners are not going to mess with adding a receptacle to a 240 circuit, even if there's a junction box there. So from a homeowner's point of view, having a junction box means finding an electrician and getting bids and paying for that upgrade. Whereas if the receptacle is there, they can just plug in. As far as the different charging standards go, my understanding is that currently for level 2 240 chargers, there are really only 2 standards. There are 3 standards for 440 chargers. But for 240 chargers, there are 2 standards, and one of them is going to go away. In any case, the actual plug configuration is irrelevant, because what you're doing is you're buying a charger that has the plug configuration that you're interested in for your car, and then you're plugging the charger into the standard 240 NEMA outlet. So I think a plug will work fine in this situation.
Thank you for that input, Thad. All right, are there any other comments on the proposal as shown, or information that could go to Kathleen to provide some additional modifications?
I added the exceptions that that the council adopted in IBC. I think there was a comment about a required parking space versus the lack of parking space. So this is the exception that was used in Iebc.
Okay. Thank you, Stoyan.
Only reservation I have is electrical vehicle supply equipment. Once again, I think supplying the circuit is adequate. Sure, you can put in the outlet. The bulk of the charging equipment I've seen has been hardwired. So that outlet would probably be removed and replaced. So it's kind of a waste, but I think just having the circuit there is adequate, not the equipment.
Okay,
I have the same concern as I had before of just on-site parking is a hard thing to define in the IRC. So that might be something to look at.
Okay. Thank you. And then we have two more hands up. Let's go with Quinn and then Kim.
Yeah, thanks, Micah. I do agree. I'll second the opinion that this should go into the electrical chapters section. I know that, even though we don't adopt the electrical chapters, we could specifically adopt certain sections of the electrical portions. And then the other thing that I just want to reiterate to everyone is the IRC is a minimum code. So I believe, having that junction box is a-okay, because we don't need it to be like that. I mean, I see what you're going with this, Thad, with your argument. As a consumer, that's what I would want. But you can, as a consumer, you could work with the builders, right? But in order for us to maintain the concept of minimum code for the IRC, we should just leave it at the junction box. My opinion.
Go ahead, Kim. Thanks, Quinn.
Thanks. My only comment is I don't think the exception 2 is necessary under 1905.1.1 because 1905.1 is charging only those new dwellings with attached garages or carports.
Did you mention exception 1?
I think she was addressing exception 2.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to let her answer. Thank you, John. Kim, do you want to specify real fast? You were indicating to eliminate exception 2.
Yeah, just exception 2 because the charging language covers that.
Agreed. She's indicating to strike exception 2, Stoyan.
Well, it depends what is the intent here. So do we have a comma here or not? Is it addressing new 1 and 2 family dwelling with or without parking and townhouses with attached private garages, or 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses with attached private garages?
Very good question.
So the comma is important here, I think.
Kathleen, what's your intent there? Do you know?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you say the options again?
So 1 and 2 family dwellings, all 1 and 2 family dwellings with or without garages, and townhouses with garages, with private garages, versus 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses with garages. So without the comma, well, comma or without, I don't know what is the intent, to address only dwelling units with garages, or all single family, all 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses with garages. I'm not sure.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah, no, all 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhomes that have attached private garages and or carports.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I do have a little question on the charging language as well, now that I'm reading it again and processing it. It seems like the townhouse with private garages and attached private carports, wouldn't that be an either or, not a both in that scenario? Like you wouldn't have to have a private garage and an attached carport for this to apply.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Micah.
Since we were on that section, it just caught my eye. All right, sounds like we have some input on this one for you, Kathleen. If there's anything else, folks, I give you one more chance to speak up. If not, we're going to move on to the other proposals so we can try to get done on time.
Can I just ask a quick question on the exception one? Again, this is for the building and not for the parcel, correct?
Good question. That would be the intent I would like to see, and that may need to be clarified, Kathleen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your feedback. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kathleen. All right, with that, we will move on to the next item in the agenda. And that will be proposal 053. Let me see if that's the correct one. I apologize, I'm going to multiple screens. Okay. And
Hi, this is Sue. I'm here.
perfect. I was just getting ready to scroll through the attendees and see if you were here.
Yes,
right.
I made it.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sue. I know you're not feeling very well, so I appreciate you being here. So please go ahead and share your proposal.
Feeling better today, so yeah. So I did review this one a little bit at the last meeting. But we'll kind of go through it in a little more detail this time. So first of all, in general, we are adding a new chapter to the IRC, and it's a chapter for existing buildings and structures. And so there's a couple sections, one in R 102.7.1, where we make some minor modifications, adding additions, alterations, or relocations shall be permitted to conform with the requirement. Repairs or alterations shall be permitted to conform. So we allow them to conform with requirements of this new chapter that we're adding. They don't have to, but it is an option. So this new chapter is just an allowance for being able to use this. This modification is just being able to use this new chapter. So I don't know if there's any questions on that. Otherwise, we can move to the next section.
Okay, I think maybe you can walk through it, and as folks process it, we can start asking questions.
Okay, let's scroll down a little bit. The next modification is just deleting some text from chapter 310.5 regarding replacement windows, and it's being put in this new chapter 44.
I have a question, and I don't know, I can't see the scrolling screen here, but 105.3, there's a discussion about unless there's a change of occupancy. And I think I asked this before, but would like clarification. So if I have an unfinished basement in a 1940s home and I create a bedroom, is that going to be considered a change of occupancy?
Yes, it would, if it was an unfinished basement and it was not previously habitable space, then yes, that's a change of occupancy.
Well, let's say it was just a family room, so it was finished and it was habitable space, and now they want to just frame in a bedroom, but we have a undersized window.
Right. So then that would not be a change of occupancy because it was single family habitable space previously, and now it's going to be a bedroom, which is still single family habitable space, but you would just need to meet the requirements for window replacements in the in this new chapter 44.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Sue, I have a question about striking 310.5. If chapter 44 is optional, where
Right.
would this section go if somebody chose not to follow chapter 44?
Well, I think there are, so this is replacement windows for emergency escape and rescue. I think that's something I'm going to have to, oh, John Sue's got his hand up. Maybe he can help me with this.
I was just going to acknowledge John there. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. I think the answer, Annie, is that this is not optional. The appendix was optional. We're putting it in the chapter 44, so it is not optional.
Okay,
Yeah,
understand.
I think it's optional from the perspective that you can either follow new construction standards or you can follow this for an existing building. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, shall be permitted is not driving language to me. So we might want to tighten that up, that's just how it's going to be. I wouldn't want to see this replacement window struck from the code if going to chapter 44 was optional.
Okay, that's a good point. Okay, I understand what you're asking. Okay. Okay. So moving on, chapter 44, scope and purpose, and it's still apply to repair, alteration, addition, and relocation of existing buildings and structures. And again, the purpose is really to try to culminate existing building provisions into one chapter, and kind of sweep them out of the new code requirements or the new structure requirements as much as possible. So, and then the next section is just a section on compliance. So it talks about how, you have to have smoke detectors, carbon monoxide alarms. And then this is the section on replacement windows, which talks about the requirements for how the replacement window, energy efficiency, safety glazing. Keep going. Fall protection for windows. And then this is this kind of duplicate section that got moved from chapter 3, replacement windows for emergency escape and rescue. And it talks about what provisions are allowed, that you put the manufacturer's largest standard size window that will fit within the existing frame or existing rough opening. And again, this is the replacement window is not part of a change of occupancy. So if that was never allowed to be a habitable space and you're changing it from storage to habitable space, that's a change of occupancy. So window opening control devices and fall protection device height, flood hazard areas, features exceeding code requirements. These are a lot of things that just sort of moved from the appendix chapter into this new chapter. So, and then, hold on just. And then next we have a section on repairs, so specifically repairs, and it talks about materials, like materials it shall be done, repairs shall be done with like materials, hazardous materials which are not permitted, plumbing materials and supplies, water closet, electrical. And again, these are similar to the section on repairs that was already in the appendix chapter. And scrolling down, and we have a chapter on alterations. This is similar to the appendix chapter. New elements shall meet the requirements of this code for new construction. Talks about engineered design shall be permitted. Alterations shall not cause the existing building to become less compliant. And then newly constructed elements shall comply with the requirements of this code. And then the exception is operable windows are not required to comply with light ventilation. And newly installed electrical equipment shall be required to comply with section 45008. Structural, there's structural alterations that decrease structural capacity. And then there's alterations that increase structural capacity, and then dead load increases. And then there's some exceptions with that. So we do have a chapter that kind of specifies, when we get concerned about alterations with regards to structural strength. I think in this case, we probably need to combine these exceptions into 1, 2, and 3. I'm not sure why there's 2 separate. Anyway, yeah, so then, and this just goes on, there's a live load increase and snow load increase on here too. Just specifying when you need to be concerned with the increases in live loads, snow loads, or wind loads, or seismic. And then a next section is on electrical equipment and wiring, methods and materials, electrical service, additional electrical requirements, enclosed areas, she'll have not let, so just specifying how many duplex receptacles. And again, much of this is just moving information that was in the previous appendix chapter. You can keep scrolling. Yeah, these are just requirements for lighting, ground fault circuit interruption, clearance requirements, and then there's some ventilation requirements, ceiling height. This is one where we have made some changes where we're the 6'8" requirement was I think that's a real benefit for builders to be able to use a shorter ceiling height, because that's where we really have some issues with trying to get these habitable spaces in either attics or basements. And so we do say habitable attic, which was not part of the original appendix chapter, but we're proposing it also be applied to habitable attics or habitable space in the basement. So not having to comply with the taller ceiling heights for some of these existing buildings really makes sense. And these are some provisions on stairways, handrails, and guards, which again is another area where it's really hard for existing buildings to comply. Especially headroom, like headroom height on existing stairs being altered or modified shall not be reduced below the existing stairway finished headrooms. So, some of those kind of things that are just, we're being reasonable for an existing building. They're just never really going to be able to comply with some of these standards for new construction. And keep going. And for me as a building official, I get for residential, I get a ton of these. Like, okay, can't we be reasonable and have, not have to comply with the higher ceiling height or the stair headroom, those kind of things. So additions, this is a section that wasn't in the original appendix, but we did add it because it seems to make sense to have a chapter on additions in this new chapter as well. Or a section on additions to an existing building, where an existing building with an addition is within the scope of the IRC. The addition will comply with this section. Horizontal attached addition. We do talk about that, alterations to existing code shall comply with the requirements governing the alterations in this code. And then we talk about wood frame light construction requirements are permitted to be used. And then we have a section on vertical additions as well. And then the last chapter is on relocations. So relocated buildings or structures moved into or within the jurisdictions are not required to comply with requirements of the code if the original use is not changed, and compliance with requirements of this chapter is required if the moved building or structure undergoes substantial alteration. Work performed on new or existing foundations shall comply with all the requirements of this code for new construction. And that's it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Sue. And just since Sue missed the introductions, Sue is the building official for the city of Tacoma. And so we appreciate her taking time to provide this proposal. Go ahead, John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple things, not questions per se. Stoyan, if you could scroll up to 4404.4.2.3, the seismic piece. Oh, let's see, down to seismic. There you go. Sorry, 2.5. The designations should be a seismic design category, D0, D1, and D2. That's just looks like the footnotes got
Oh
lost,
yeah,
or the
thanks, John. I think they got yanked off accidentally. Yeah. Okay.
And Sue, this is the loading. This particular thing on the seismic is based on the what's happening at the national level. Is that correct? What's being proposed?
Yeah, that's correct. I grabbed a bunch of proposals with regards to modifying this appendix that were being proposed by someone else at national, and then just incorporated those in these structural requirements.
Is there value to include seismic design category E in that laundry list under the seismic load increase provisions, now that the state of Washington has E?
Good question.
Considered for.
That's probably a question
yeah,
we
I
need
think
to look
so.
at.
Yeah, we could put that in as put that in, and then we'll check into it with our structural.
Happy to give up our seismic
Committee.
design category E though.
Great question, Andy. I think that's something that Sue can request information on. All right. Do we want to go through some of the sections for additional questions? Todd, you have your hand up, please.
Yeah, thanks. So I just was curious, this language being much or in the appendix in the past, what was the current status? Were people or local jurisdictions adopting the appendix, or is this just something that the code seems to be navigating towards putting in the body of the code, and this is just kind of the natural progression that's going to eliminate confusion and having every jurisdiction trying to decide what should we do in these instances?
So I can answer from city of Tacoma's perspective. We amended, well, what we actually did, because you can't amend the IRC, we amended the Iebc, and then we added this appendix chapter to the Iebc. It was kind of a little bit hokey, but that's how we managed to do it. And we modified it, with some of our local requirements that we were already using in a minimum building and structures code. So we were using it, we have been using it, and so that's kind of the reason. It would be really nice to have it as a statewide thing, because for our purposes, again, we were we were always getting requests for shorter ceiling heights for attics and basements, or modifications, some alternate for the stair headroom. Just, Tacoma's an old city, and it's really hard. It's hard for some of these existing buildings to comply, and they want to increase the usability of their building. Their home. They want to add a bedroom or add a family room or something like that. And I think it's important to be able to provide some flexibility for these existing buildings, because again, they're not, it's safer for us to, require get the windows in, get the smoke detectors, those kind of things, than somebody just starting to use this space as a bedroom and never have any of those things in. So we really do want them to get permitted, and I think it's reasonable for us to allow these lesser standards for existing buildings.
Okay, thank you. And I'm curious to know what some of the builders think about this proposal.
It looks, I haven't done a comparison between Appendix J and the list, but if it's very close, I mean, everything we went over, I see no issues with, without digging really deeper into it.
Okay, thanks, Damon. We do have a hand up from John and then Quinn, and then we can maybe go back to some additional input from the builders on that question.
Yeah, I think some of the information we heard before was that there were some jurisdictions who were using provisions out of the appendix as part of their what they were enforcing, possibly as policies or whatever. But so it again, for uniformity across the state, it's good to have something that all jurisdictions are looking at the same thing.
Okay, great point. Go ahead, Quinn.
Yeah, similar to what John was saying, I've worked at several jurisdictions, and one of them didn't adopt Appendix J or any form of it. And basically, for any remodels or for unfinished basements, you have to meet new construction standards, and that usually puts the kibosh on a lot of the projects. So having something like this would definitely help builders, contractors, and homeowners to start utilizing their spaces, because otherwise it is the standards for new construction at that point for some jurisdictions currently.
All right, thank you, Quinn. All right.
Is there a way we could just make Appendix J required?
I think that I mean, you could, but Appendix J hasn't been maintained by the ICC. So we had to do quite a bit of work to, to get it up and running and to get it updated. I mean, that's a possibility, is to allow Appendix J. To be, you're saying, I mean, if it's not a chapter that's in the code, then it's not required, and then it would be, maybe an optional, or the state could just say, well, you could have the appendix, that either the state could say we're going to require this appendix, or it be optional for jurisdictions. But again, if you're making it optional, again, it's not going to be consistent across the state. So whether people are going to adopt this appendix or not.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of, not knowing that it hasn't been well maintained by ICC. I thought it might be easier to go ahead and adopt it. One quick comment about 4405.2, the exception. I think we've got a little grammatical error there that needs to be fixed. Where are we? The exception there under horizontal attached additions. Should that read the additional structural components may be connected to the existing building? Or are you trying to say the addition structural components? The additions structural components.
You're under vertical additions?
I'm under horizontal attached addition, the exception there. So are you, is it the additions, apostrophe S structural components may be
Yes.
attached, or is it the additional structural components?
Yeah. No, you're right. The structural components of the addition. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. That's a good one.
Good question. Thank you, Annie. And John, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you want to add something?
Basically, Sue covered it. It was that the the appendix is not has not been kept up to date, and that was something that was very clearly pointed out to us. So, yeah, there's a lot of things that needed to be fixed. Plus, it deals with some other, different levels that were difficult to enforce, such as I think renovations, and there were just totally different terminology than what we're used to. So we felt that this was much clearer.
Would this belong earlier in the code? Maybe like at the end of chapter 3 rather than at the end of the code itself?
If I could respond to that, I think the idea is that, first of all, not to make everything renumbered, which would be a terrible thing to do to staff. But also, it's similar to the way the Iebc was structured way long time ago in the UBC. Back for those of us who remember that, is that there was a separate chapter 34 right at the end of the code that dealt with the existing structures, existing buildings, and so this kind of corresponds with that.
Thank you, John, for answering that question.
I think the other thing too is to really, to have one chapter that's, again, dedicated to existing buildings, and know that there's one chapter you go to instead of it being kind of incorporated into another section. That, again, like it was like the it was the way the Iebc used to be, and and this will, I think, prevent confusion on what, when does the Iebc apply to IRC buildings? And there is a lot of confusion about that. Can we use the Iebc for IRC buildings? And so having this chapter be applied for for existing buildings really kind of eliminates having to jump over to the Iebc for these IRC structures.
Are these the same provisions as the Iebc for residential? What you're proposing?
Well, no, they're different in the sense that we're more permissive for these existing buildings. I mean, it's similar, but it's not the same as the Iebc chapter because that's more extensive. So
would people still have an option of using the Iebc if they didn't like something they saw here? But it sounds like this is more
flexible. We aren't preventing it.
Okay.
I think there's definitely kind of a movement nationally to try to not have to go to the Iebc for IRC structures. So I think there is just confusion about when you do go to it and how do you apply these provisions that are more designed for commercial code.
I have
go ahead, Troy.
Question about the economic impact. We were struggling with this cost benefit analysis because we didn't have enough information. So for here, can we say that there is no economic impact versus yes, and without specifying items that will will decrease the price?
I think so. I'm going to have to look at, it looks like there might be something that got missed in this section, but I mean, if there is an economic impact, it's less, it'd be, less of a cost, but I'll have to take a look at that section again.
Okay, if we can coordinate later on that.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. It looks like something's missing.
Thank you, Stoyan. Okay. And Damien, I wanted to come back to you for a moment too, and maybe some other builders and you know, now that we've gone through the proposal, maybe answer some questions and get a little more feedback on your thoughts on this proposal. If there's anything you'd like to provide Sue for any additional comments or what?
Yeah, once again, I'd like to take some time to read through it thoroughly, but I like the direction this is going myself at the moment. You know, right out of the gate, our 10271 gives you the option of following code or following chapter 4, the new chapter 44. And it's always good when we get all of the items for alterations and repairs into one space. So right now, this looks really good, but I would like to, you know, read it in detail.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Thank you for that input. Is there any additional input or questions, comments for this proposal from the TAG or public? All right. So it sounds like we don't have very many modifications to make to this or minor modifications. We would like to hear back on the Group E seismic or Category E seismic information from the structural folks. And if we can, bring that back at the next meeting, and then we can vote on this as a package, I believe, at that time. Or make a recommendation to move forward to the BFP committee. So with that, we will move on to the next proposal. And I'm sorry, I don't have a number prepared just yet. I'll switch over and say it. I believe we're moving on to 092, and that would be an appendix modification or new appendix, and that would be Kinley. If you're prepared, Kinley, please take over.
Yep, I'm here. Hi. I have my video on. I thought I would just wave and say hi, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn it off to save my bandwidth. I seem to be having a little bit of trouble with connectivity, but my coworker Kathleen Petrie can jump in for me if need be. But I will go ahead and run through a quick overview. So yeah, I proposed Appendix W, Construction and Demolition Materials Management. It is an optional appendix, and the goal of it is to reduce the amount of construction demolition waste that is going to landfills after leaving construction sites. It's in support of the 2021 Washington State Solid and Hazardous Waste Plan, and a lot of the waste reduction goals of a lot of the different municipalities around the state. For jurisdictions where material management is a priority, the language helps to increase the amount of material that is salvaged for reuse or recycled. It makes both easier to do. There are two forms that are part of this code change proposal, a salvage assessment form and a waste diversion report form. This proposal would require that both forms be used and submitted to the local building department. Hold on just a second. All right, thanks. Sorry for that. I'll see if I can keep the dogs quiet. Let's see. So prior to beginning a project, the project would complete the salvage assessment form, allowing the owner to thoughtfully identify possible materials, systems, and appliances that might be salvaged from the building as it is dismantled. Once identified, the materials sorry.
It's all right. No worries.
Give me just a second.
Pause just a second, wait for Kinley to come back. And if he's delayed much longer, we'll have Kathleen jump in.
I'm here. Sorry about that.
No problem.
All right. Thanks for your patience. So yeah, once identified, the materials that are in the building that have salvage value, it's a lot easier to put a system in place to recover those materials. And saving materials extends the life of the landfill, helps with carbon sequestration, reducing carbon emissions for any and all the materials pretty much that are reused. And it has a special benefit for wood materials. We're working to get the wood, reusable wood out of older buildings, so a lot better quality than the wood that's available today, and working on getting systems in place to reuse that wood. Completing the diversion report at the end of the project would show what materials went to landfill or were recycled or were salvaged. And that allows jurisdictions to kind of get an idea as to, or to be able to track better where materials are going from projects in their jurisdictions, and helps with reporting to the state, and helps with meeting their own diversion goals. It's appropriate as an Appendix X, or as an appendix, because not all communities in Washington State have salvage retail businesses available at this time. We're seeing statewide and nationally actually kind of an increase in salvage material reuse businesses. And not all places around the state have C&D recycling facilities readily available at this time. But making this code available for jurisdictions would kind of be the first step to supporting an increase in their jurisdictions of businesses that would use these materials. The forms are already available, would reduce jurisdictions from having to develop them themselves. So basically with this appendix, the idea is just to get the basic code language and the forms out there and available to jurisdictions within the state that are looking for this information. There's a more detailed code package that we've put together with what we call the regional code collaboration in the Puget Sound area, that a number of jurisdictions are looking at adopting, and this is kind of a scaled down version of this that would is more feasible for statewide consideration by different jurisdictions. So, any questions, suggestions? I'd love to hear them.
Okay, thank you, Kenley. And we have Jen with her hand up.
A couple times in this section, we refer to it as this code, and I would suggest referring to it instead as this section, because usually when we say this code, we're talking about the entire code. So that appears here in the salvage assessment. I saw it up in purpose. Yep. I'm not sure if it's somewhere else. In the waste diversion report, not all projects are going to have a certificate of occupancy. So I don't know if we want to change that to approval of the final inspection or some other something other than certificate of occupancy.
Okay.
And then I guess for an alteration for a small project by a homeowner, I'm just understand for a bigger, like we're going to demolish an entire house, that kind of thing. But just wondering how this report will be handled by a homeowner with a smaller project. How easy or feasible is it?
Well, it depends on the type of project. There is the size, let's see, I believe it's 750 square feet is what we have set as the size threshold. And I mean, for most home remodels, it's certainly feasible to do this, actually. Especially if you're talking about a bathroom remodel. Yep, thanks for highlighting that, 750 square feet. If you're talking about a bathroom remodel or a kitchen remodel, there's almost always materials in there that have some salvage value.
What about an addition? So there might be an addition where you're demoing like a wall where the addition will go. So is the work area considered the demo area or the size of the addition, which could be pretty large?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how most jurisdictions would interpret that.
Or maybe we would just use the monetary.
Yeah,
cut
They
off.
might. Yeah, it might make sense to use the monetary in that case. I mean, I would guess that issue comes up with other remodel codes. I don't know how it's addressed elsewhere.
Okay. Thank you for the questions, Jen. Additional questions or thoughts from the TAG or public?
Damon Doyle here. I don't see, you've not set any thresholds for, say, percentage of recycling by weight, or are there any thresholds set anywhere in here?
Nope. No, there aren't. Some different jurisdictions may have specific thresholds that they've set within their other code sections. And they could say that this applies to that, but no, we didn't specify it within this section.
So really, this is just a paperwork process. Is the thought being that having this appendix, if a jurisdiction should adopt it, that the paperwork process might incentivize recycling or reuse?
Correct. Yep. It's basically makes the tools readily available to jurisdictions that are wanting to use it. And it makes it more standardized across the state, which will in the end make things easier for the industry.
I was the primary author of the rewrite of the Built Green program. And one of the big struggles we had, because recycling and reuse is a big portion of it, was Eastern Washington just simply didn't have the facilities to do that. And so we had to drop the threshold for the entire state to be able to accommodate the entire state on that. So while I strongly am a proponent of it, I just know that it just doesn't exist in a lot of places.
Yep. And the idea is that making this available is kind of like a first step of allowing jurisdictions to start figuring out ways to incentivize the reuse industry in areas where it isn't currently present.
Okay, thank you.
I have a comment, Ms. Ron. On the affidavit that's to be signed by the owner as to who, what, where the material goes, I have a bit of concern with that, because the owner sometimes will just contract with got junk on some of this, or maybe it's with a recycling firm and they have no idea of where this material is going to be reused, and you're kind of putting the owner on the hook by having them sign an affidavit.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to pull up the affidavit section here. Yeah, and the main point of the affidavit is, sorry, the origin of the affidavit kind of came from what we heard from the clean air agencies and the hazardous waste agencies of wanting to make sure that there was some ownership or responsibility for that the hazardous materials were handled appropriately. And that's kind of been extended here. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what others think about that aspect of it, I guess.
Okay. Jen, do you have a hand up? What?
Yeah, I understand affidavit is a legal term. So are we just asking them to sign a statement, or do we really want to use the word affidavit?
Good question. Statement might be sufficient.
There's also currently no place on the form for a signature.
Good point.
Okay. Other thoughts or questions? Jen, you still have a hand up. Is that residual?
No, but I mean, I still do have questions.
Oh, feel free, please.
So I guess just back to somebody pointed out that there's not necessarily a requirement for like percentages of what needs to be recycled. So what are they agreeing to, that they'll do the statement and the report? They don't really need to divert anything. I'm just a little confused. It's like you're required, but then it's sort of like, well, what is the actual meat of the requirement?
Right. It's the truth in reporting, essentially. I mean, in King County, where we have a system that we've set up, we require the reporting so that we have a trail, so that we can do enforcement if we so choose, on verifying that the materials have gone to where they say they've gone. So that's basically a large part of it, is just providing the accountability that the reporting was done and is accurate.
Again, just to confirm though, any project could take these forms and say, we have diverted nothing, and they would still be in compliance, correct?
If they in fact didn't report anything, didn't divert anything, yeah.
Okay, we have Kathleen with a hand up, and then Todd when Kathleen is done.
Thank you, Micah. Just to build upon what Kinley was mentioning, Seattle has had this requirement since 2014, and Kinley, correct the percentage, but there was an assessment done by the owner of Second Use, one of the resale outfits in Seattle, and they had seen it was at a 5 or 10% increase in salvaged material volume based on the starting of this program. So it is beginning to, in this area, move more materials into a retail industry that could be extracted and utilized, just thereby saving resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, I was just curious, are there people that come around and do this, that collect this and repurpose it, or is it just going to be the general contractor hiring a demo crew that might have a branch that notes things, and as we've already kind of said, it goes wherever it goes?
Good question, Todd. Do you want to try to answer that, Kinley or Kathleen?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question, Todd?
Sure, sorry. So I'm just curious, is this going to cost people money to have somebody come and take these items that are recyclable? Is there the value, is somebody going to do that to have the items and repurpose, or, is there a emerging industry that's going to occur, or do we have any idea?
Yeah, I think that's part of the ingenuity, if you will, for this appendix. So the jurisdiction who wants to utilize this, as well as the deconstruction appendix that we're going to be talking about next, it's how the jurisdiction wants to use it. So for example, what our responsibility is in King County is to create the infrastructure of skills that would perhaps conduct the assessments. It will create that awareness to the building industry that we need to start being mindful about what could actually be salvaged instead of just crunching up the building at all, landfilling everything. So, we've had discussions with our salvage retailers. Is the assessment going to take cost? No, because they're actually seeing benefit from it. So they're working with the code to increase their volume and the amount of product they can move and their profits. So I think that is an open question, a good question, and that the jurisdiction would do their due diligence to figure out how is the industry going to respond? Do we have the infrastructure to do this? How could we build the infrastructure? In an equity component, it's like, how do we create these skill sets and create a new industry and labor that's going to benefit us in, environmentally and whatnot. So I think that's kind of open for the jurisdiction.
Hey, Kathleen, I've got my connection back. That was very good. I would just add to it that in the Puget Sound area where we have the existing infrastructure, the salvage companies go out to projects and collect the materials at no cost.
Okay, thank you, Kinley. All right, Annie, we have your hand up as well.
So this particular code proposal, which is in an appendix that is optional by jurisdiction, it's really creating that tracking mechanism. They're required to do an assessment on anything they're demolishing, meeting those thresholds. And then there's a diversion report. That diversion report only reports what was diverted, correct?
Well, in the diversion report, they place on there what was diverted and what was sent to landfill. So if a jurisdiction did want to keep track of diversion rates, percentages or something, they could off of that form. But yeah, it has both the materials that were, well, it has the materials that were recycled, materials that were used, and materials that went to landfill.
So how would somebody identify the weight or volume of project generated construction and demolition material that went to, you know, a new purpose?
It's usually estimated, they usually track it by volume, and then there's conversions that are used. We have on our website.
Well, again, I'm just thinking in terms of, say, Habitat for Humanity says, I want all the kitchen cabinets in that kitchen remodel.
Right.
How is that quantified in order to fill out the report? It just seems like there's, you know, we have very few resources out on the peninsula. Heck, our dump doesn't even take glass for recycling anymore. So it's a real tough environment out here. And I just see the difficulty of maybe completing this waste diversion report to the completeness of expectation.
Right. And I mean, it's usually a rough estimate. And I found that in collecting and looking at these forms that we've been using, Seattle's been using for a number of years now, that people just estimate. And usually they're not too far off. When you're trying to estimate the weight of a whole building or the volume of a whole building, how much space it's going to take up, everybody's off by quite a bit. But when you look at individual materials or a set of cabinets or something like that, people usually aren't too far off. And what we have in the Puget Sound area at this point is that each of the salvage companies, when they collect materials, they create an itemized list of what they took. And then they have, each of their systems has conversions. So they just plug the material into their database and it kicks out a weight. So I get weight and lists of items for them. But we understand that not everybody's that advanced at this point, and it's going to take a while to get there. But just doing a rough estimate of a set of cabinets, it tends to be just fine.
So what about the issues of lead-based paint and asbestos containing materials?
Those still apply. Those things need to, any asbestos material cannot be reused. Lead-based paint materials, if it is encapsulated, is still considered fine for reuse, but should be labeled as lead-containing paint. So this doesn't get into the hazardous materials aspect of it. There's other rules and regulations that apply to those materials.
But the end goal is that a jurisdiction would approve this appendix and then in essence require that a certain percentage of the building be repurposed or recycled.
Yeah. Yep. And hazardous materials are exempt from those calculations.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Any additional questions or comments? Right. I do have one comment. I know there are some jurisdictions that do not issue a certificate of occupancy for the 1 and 2 family code, that where they modify their administrative section of the code I imagine that we could add some language in there where prior to issuance of the certificate of occupancy or a completed final inspection, I do know there are some jurisdictions that only do a final inspection. Just a recommendation there.
Yeah, that would be a good addition. We will add that in. Is it all right for us to make a couple of amendments based on what was discussed today and resubmit?
Absolutely. I think you could take some of the information provided today and modify the proposal and come back and we'll review it at the try to be the last meeting, the next one, before we move these recommended proposals over to the BFP committee.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions or comments on this appendix proposal? Okay, hearing none, I will close this one out and we will move on to, I believe, the final proposal for the day.
So what is the recommendation for that one?
I believe they're going to take some of the recommended comments today and go back and provide some minor modifications to it and bring it back to us.
Okay. The next one is 093.
Yes, thank you.
There is a competition for Appendix W.
There is, and this looks like an alternative language, but a similar idea. So I'm going to let Kathleen take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Micah, and everybody. This actually works in partnership, or could work in partnership with the previous proposal. So essentially, this would actually require deconstruction of buildings of a certain age or earlier. And so, you know, deconstruction is the systematic disassembly of a building versus just crunching it up, landfilling everything by pulling it apart, either with a hybrid use of machinery and human labor, or just all human labor. You can separate everything. So your wood goes in pile, your metals, your whatnot. You have the opportunity to take out appliances, windows, you know, whatever you want to, whatever you think or the salvage retailer thinks has value. And so this code would basically say, again, this would be optional, and it would be for those jurisdictions that have interest in this, that buildings built or that are, and I know this is odd, but it was hard to calculate what age is the appropriate age. City of Portland currently has a requirement for buildings prior to 1940 to be deconstructed instead of demolished. So in doing an analysis of jurisdictions across Washington state, it's very challenging. So we made a conservative number. And so really 1930-ish. And so we put in a term of 90 years or earlier because, and that can change. Of course, it's just a starting place here for this discussion, but it puts us, about in the 1930s. And so if you're single family or a townhouse going to be demolished, then you'd have to deconstruct it unless it's historic. Or if it's going to be, if it's historic. Let's start over, sorry. Anyways, so the exceptions to this would be that if they're unsafe, structure is going to be relocated, or perhaps the building official, or we can modify that to say engineer of record has determined that the structure is unsuitable for reuse. So whether it's, you've got mold issues or whatnot, somebody can say, hey, there's just nothing of value here. And so that's the essence of the proposal. Just to throw in some other inputs is that we have a partnering code section in the IRC, R602.1.1, which basically says that you can reuse existing dimensional sawn lumber and you can assume certain design strengths without having it be regraded. So these two code sections then partner very well. You pull the material out of a building, you put it back into another building, assuming certain design strengths. And then again, just to kind of throw in that carbon component and environmental component, 2,000 square foot home can yield 6,000 square feet of board feet for reusable lumber. And if not, you'd have about 127,000 tons of debris that would be landfilled without doing this. So again, it's an optional appendix for jurisdictions who are interested. It could work in partnership or independently of the prior code bit. Anyways, thank you very much. Would appreciate any feedback or questions.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. I'm going to open the floor for comments and discussion. All right, pretty quiet out there. From Jen, did you? Jen came unmuted. I'll let you start. Go ahead, Jen.
Just the same small suggestion as I made with the last one, to say this section instead of this code, unless you mean to refer to the whole code.
Great, thank you very much, Jen.
Okay. As I process both of these, I am always a little. I mean, if we want to do this, I think we want to capture more than just buildings. You do have in the first sentence, building as a defined term. However, to me, those are sometimes, at least in my interpretation, separate from structures. And so I think is an opportunity where you could have a structure that is technically not a building that could also benefit from the use of this appendix if it's adopted. That's just a thought. Maybe it's buildings and structures, or buildings or structures, something of that nature, to where you would capture both of those definitions, since they are both defined terms in the IRC. But again, not vital.
Thank you, Micah. Good suggestion.
And then we have Quinn with your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, Micah, that's a good point. I didn't see that last time. And I just want to say thanks to Kathleen and Kinley for meeting with me after we had our last tag meeting for me to bring up some of my points too. But yeah, so going back to your suggestions about buildings and structure, because later on in the scope, they do go back to referring it to structures. So it's kind of mixing terms potentially. So if we say both buildings or structure is demolished, and then later on the structure or building has been identified. So if you could just somehow combine the two or something.
Great, thank you. And Quinn, would you like to talk a little bit about some of the feedback you provided when we chatted? Shall I present some modifications to this and see if folks are in alignment or if they're unnecessary or?
Let's see here. It's been a while. I just got back on vacation, so let's see if I can remember some of it.
One thing you had mentioned is to actually tie, per the code text, this section with R602.1.1. And so I was thinking the last sentence of W101.1 purpose could just say salvaged use sawn lumber may be reused in accordance with section R602.1.1.1.
Yeah, that would be a good, at least my opinion, somehow refer it to how the officials and inspectors would determine if for structurally, if some of the sawn lumbers are okay, somehow tying it back to that section where it talks about what's appropriate and what's not.
Great, thank you.
All right. Good comments. Go ahead, Kinley.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak again briefly about the name for the proposal. Both this one and this one, as you noticed, were proposed as Appendix W, and that was just because that was the next blank spot in line. We assumed whichever one gets approved first would be Appendix W, and if the next one's approved, that would be Y, Appendix Y. So they're not in conflict with each other. Just wanted to reiterate that.
You know, the way they're numbered, it looks like they are the same appendix.
Yeah. And maybe we should rename one of them. I guess it would be WXBX, right? That comes next. I need to learn my alphabet.
I think that could be a correlation item if we determine that both of these proposals should move forward as separate proposals, or if we do want to look at combining these proposals. It seems like they are very similar in scope. And maybe we just correlate the numbers or letters if both of these get approved, and that way jurisdictions may have the option for going for either one. But I think it's just a correlation item.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Mike, there was one more thing I remember talking to both Kathleen and Kinley about. Because this is an appendix in the IRC, kind of going back with what the issue that Sue had with Appendix J, there were two issues, right? The first one is that appendices tend to be left on the wayside for every code cycle. So this would definitely need to be, if it gets approved, we would need to, make sure it's updated every code cycle, and it doesn't, after 10 code cycles later, we start looking at it. The other issue is because it's in IRC, how difficult is it to modify it? Because, the language is pretty vague enough to allow jurisdictions to modify it per their ordinances or jurisdictions requirements, and then adopt it. But because of Appendix J that Tacoma had to go through, we had to do it through the Iebc and not through the IRC. So that's something to think about as well.
Yeah, thank you, Quinn.
Kinley, did you have something additional to add? You have your hand up still.
Oh, sorry. Nope, that's residual.
That's
All of
okay.
it. Thanks.
Want to verify. All right, folks. Any other comments, questions, thoughts on this proposal?
Sure, this is Annie, Peninsula Housing Authority.
Thank you.
I'm a little distressed by this proposal. I see where you're going. I surely appreciate it. Is there somewhere in this proposal that it says what things have to be salvaged? Because I get, again, to what degree do we have to salvage every piece of material that comes out of a house or a building that's being demolished?
Yeah, really, really good question, Annie. So again, this would be for the jurisdiction who is creating that infrastructure, who's making sure they have enough deconstruction contractors, enough salvage retailer folks out there that can move the material. And if that's the case, then you just let the industry kind of drive itself. So that would be up to the jurisdiction to do their due diligence on that. But there's no requirement to salvage anything. However, if you've got things that are source separated on site, you can, and if your location has access to just even recycling, proper C&D recycling, then that may be a good choice. And it's, you've systematically, you've got your things in piles and you're moving those to the right receiving locations. So it would, I fully appreciate your concerns. So this really would be language that's available to the jurisdiction that has that infrastructure and is ready to do this.
But there's no charging language in here that requires that anything be salvaged or reused. They just can't use heavy equipment destroying the building.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Yeah. So help me with scope. I see that if it's over 750 square feet in size and meet one of two categories, why would an 85-year-old house not be a house that would be held to this salvage standard?
A great question. It's a challenge of figuring out that year, and when we can't modify the IRC, then what year do you put in there? So in the analysis that was done, if you do like a 1940 date, a city like Tacoma has so much historic building stock, it equates to almost like 75% of their demolition permits. And the year I did the crunch of numbers on, I think was 2019 demo permits. What of that housing stock was prior to 1940? And it was a huge percentage. It's too much for what the infrastructure that they may have. They may not have that amount of bodies, skill sets to keep up with the volume. Versus, a city like Kent, who may not have any homes under, 1930. And so it's trying to find that happy medium when you're doing this at a state level. And so, yeah.
Then why put in a date at all? I mean, if the true goal is to increase the amount of materials salvaged, why not a 1989 house that's being removed because of whatever reason?
Because if you've got the lumber is very different from 1980 forward. There's not a lot of like lumber in particular that you want to extract from that, although there are other materials. But if you make it so that of the 130 permits for demolition issued in, say, city of Kirkland, are all required to be deconstructed, do you have that much labor that can do all of that? Are the skill sets built up to handle that volume?
Okay. So who's removing all the nails from the wood? I look at this and go, this is a great aspiration, but to put it in the code and to have so much, so much flexibility, we'll call it, with how this is applied throughout a state as diverse as Washington. I realize that the jurisdictions have the ability to approve it or not, but still, it just seems like there needs to be some more fine tuning. Like I said earlier, we don't even have glass recycling on the peninsula anymore. Right. And do I just wind up with a city manager that's really gung-ho about this and it gets approved and now we're having to work within it? I think we need to look at the cost of doing this.
Yeah, I fully appreciate that. And Kinley and Alex, maybe you can share a little bit more, but just to kick a response off is that, I think it depends on how the deconstruction is being done by that particular contractor. And so if they're removing nails on site, that just may be a part of their process. If they're taking things away in clumps of building to be processed someplace else, that could be a different tactic. Kinley, are you still on the line? Or Alex?
Yep. Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, there's a number of different ways that the building materials are processed, can be processed. And there's a number of different companies around the state, that do their own processing of materials. And there are other systems where the wood is going someplace else and then being processed. And we're also in the Puget Sound area, we're looking at systems for doing an automatic process consolidation of reusable lumber from a wide area, and then doing some high-tech processing of it to basically cut out the parts and do a finger joining process to create new studs. But generally around the state, there'll be businesses that are doing the nail removal or other upgrading of the materials. And some businesses have actually found that there's value in processing them. They purchase a property and that has an existing house that needs to come down. They'll process the house and then they process the wood that comes out of it and use that as construction for the new building that they set up there. And they're finding that to be economical to do. So there's different models, different ways of doing it. Different companies do things differently, and each jurisdiction is going to have their own companies that are being developed around this. So it is, it's an optional appendix at this point, and it's it's there to help jurisdictions move the industry forward.
It does cost. The Housing Authority removed, I think it was 24 buildings, single family, two family here a couple of years ago, so that we could densify the area. And we had, just because our funding required, we did have to deconstruct and recycle. And it was a very expensive process out on the peninsula. And the one thing that I think we don't want to lose sight of is this is a time-consuming process if it's done on site. And I just think that we need to be really aware of the true ramifications and the true cost associated with something of this magnitude.
Yep.
If I could chime in.
Go ahead.
I did actually went through this process 14 years ago on a project. We were able to deconstruct the home in about a week. When I compared it to the cost of demolishing and landfilling the home, I actually saved money. They came out, pulled all the sheets off the roof, used a palm nailer to denail the sheets. The trusses were recycled. They all went to reuse. There was a company at the time that was called Olympia Deconstruction. They unfortunately no longer exist. But yeah, it's an interesting process. I love it as an option. I love having some guidelines for builders to use in order to do it, as long as it's voluntary and market driven.
And I would just add that down in Portland, once they began requiring deconstruction of, and now it's 1940 and earlier homes, they found that the cost for deconstruction actually ended up being less than demolition. It was partly because of the competition between the different companies that were doing deconstruction. That was the main thing, I think, but it became cost competitive. And up here in our region, there's a lot of energy that's been put towards hybrid deconstruction, kind of like Damon talked about, of using some fancier methods for taking the materials down and more efficiently. It used to take like a month to take a building down, and now the companies in this area are doing it in about a week for a house, for a home.
Excellent. Thank you for that input. Thanks, Damon. All right. Any other comments or input on this proposal for the proponents? All right. Hearing none, I think there are still a few little minor modifications, Kathleen, that I think were suggested, and we will look forward to seeing those at the next meeting. We'll be able to keep those short, I hope. I know we're down about one meeting, and maybe Stoyan's starting to sweat it a little bit, but I do think we will still get through these proposals, because it sounds like we have a few minor modifications to some of them, and then the TAG can vote whether or not to recommend moving these forward to the BFP committee. And then also, I know we have one large proposal left to discuss at the next meeting, which will be lofts with some minor modifications for that upcoming. So I believe that concludes the review of the proposals on today's agenda. I gotta go back to the agenda on a different screen, so I do apologize. All right, that was the last one. So the next or last item would be other business. Are there any other topics that folks want to talk about? It could be a previous proposal if you want to add some additional input for proponents that are making modifications to those that we can hear at the next meeting. That would be fine as well. So other business today?
I want to ask the proponents, because we will have 8 proposals at the next meeting on June 6th, and this is the last one. And we really need to get this through because we are competing against the time. If we don't get the proposals done, then we have to delay the council meeting, and if we delay the council meeting, staff won't have time to file the proposals. So I don't want to get into details on that, but so for the proponents, can you folks send me the new versions, and when you're making the changes, if you can use track changes. So in this case, for the next meeting, we can show where the changes are versus, stuff comparing and working on each change. This will save us some time. And if you can send me your modified proposals as soon as possible, in this case, I will post the proposals on the website, and the rest of the folks still have enough time to review and reevaluate. That's my request.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you, Stoyan. Hearing no other new business, moving on to item number 6, we will call for adjournment. I appreciate everybody's time today, and we look forward to reviewing the proposals again at the next tag, which I believe is June 6th. Stoyan, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
June 6th, yes.
Okay, perfect. June 6th, and we will try to move what the tag recommends forward to the BFP committee. And for those of you that may be new to this process, this is not your final opportunity to provide modifications. You can continue to provide modifications to the BFP committee and then additionally on to the State Building Code Council if your proposal either gets recommended for approval or disapproval. So please know that this is not the final opportunity at the tag or to present your material and make changes. So again, I appreciate everybody's time today, and we will adjourn until the 6th of June. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.